How does UNICEF's work on climate change and children's welfare align with the goals of the Pact for the Future?
Look, let me say that we are convening here with the world,
Hmm.
I would say, at a time of really complex and interrelated crises. It's climate change, absolutely, and I'm happy to talk about that. But it's also the rise of poverty, the
Hmm.
rise of inequality, public health emergencies, COVID, mpox, and others, and particularly also the rise of conflicts, right? We are now facing more conflicts than we've had ever before since the Second World War. And all of these interconnected crises are impacting the lives and the futures of children in a way we haven't seen before. At the moment, right now, as we speak, we know that 1 billion children are at extreme risk of climate change. 1 billion children.
Wow.
It's just hard to imagine what that means. Looking at 3.8 billion children that are currently under 30 years of age, and the next 30 years, we have 4.2 billion new lives coming to Earth.
Wow.
And what future they will inherit is what all of the governments, all of the private sector companies, all of the NGOs and UN entities such as ourselves, UNICEF, the future that they inherit is the future that we will make together. It's not predetermined that the misery that we see now and that runaway climate change that we see now will continue to impact the lives and futures of children because we have a choice that we can make. And the pact of the future and the promises embedded in that pact is a conveyor belt to keep climate change in check and a conveyor belt to bring peace, to bring stability, prosperity, and hope for all of the children living now and the 4.2 million children that we'll see over the next 30 years. And that's why this pact is so critically important.
What could be some of the biggest challenges UNICEF faces in implementing some of the policies mentioned in Pact for the Future and the policies you just mentioned?
One of the major challenges that we had, I will say to the viewers that when the first draft of the pact came out, children were not mentioned.
Wow.
The pact was child blind.
Mm.
Why? Because on average, the negotiators here, the policymakers that we have in our countries are what? 40 years plus of age, and it's quite a while ago since they were a child, and they may not always be aware of how uniquely vulnerable children are. Now, if you see the final text of the pact, if you see how we're changing in the convention body on climate change, we are getting children their rightful stage on the podium and within policies to make the world understand how uniquely vulnerable they are, but also how much agency they have in shaping their own future. So what I want everybody to understand that the pact is a promise. We have to deliver on that promise with action. When it comes to conflict, when it comes to climate change, children are uniquely vulnerable. But what does climate change do to children? Well, that actually begins before children are born, and few people realize that. What we see with heat waves, for example, is that women give birth far too early because their bodies can't cope with the heat and the pregnancy. So children are born too early and they start disadvantaged with low birth weight. We see that breast milk is impacted with heat waves. So children born too small don't get enough nutrients. What happens to girls?
Mm.
What we see now is that girl marriage is going up. When there are economic shocks like hurricanes, like heat waves, poor parents are forced to marry off their girls because it's one mouth less to feed. What we have done for the first time ever in the climate negotiations, in 30 years of climate negotiation, we brought child advocates on climate change on the stage to
Wonderful.
speak about their lived experience. For the first time ever, we've had executive board meetings with children 14 years of age from Colombia, from Barbados, speaking about what climate change is doing to their lives, that they can't go to school because hurricanes destroyed their schools. That is what we need to do. That is what we are trying to do with child participation. What we see actually is that most children, and I would say particularly girls, are extremely energized
Mm.
to be part of these discussions, to shape the future of policies that will protect them, and that they actually know very well, A, what needs to be done, and B, what policies are needed to protect them well. And it is our role as UNICEF to give them that stage.
Do you think the commitments will be enough for those youth advocates to inspire them to be more energized, to feel that they have, the government's back around the world?
What I do know and what they know is that commitments are great, but commitments are written down on a piece of paper.
Yes.
And if we are not careful, commitments start to gather dust in some drawer somewhere in a bureaucracy. So now is the time that commitments need to be translated, A, into policies, and B, into finance streams to actually make sure that these policies change the lives of children and young people on the ground. All governments have to submit their new climate plans in 2025. That means we have a once-in-a-generation lifetime to make sure that the commitments that all countries do add up in a way that we keep the emissions down and we keep the world of 1.5 degrees within reach, that we make sure that the climate policies that they submit are actually child responsive. And so making sure that policies are child-centric, making sure that finance streams then follow through. Remind that out of all of the money that is being spent in the world today on climate finance, and we're talking billions here, only 2.4% is programmed in a child-responsive way. In other ways, on social adaptive humanitarian cash programs for children that need it, on education programs, on health.